I'll just hop right into it and hopefully stay on time. And I'm around a little bit later if y'all want to ask questions based on your schedule. I'm not going anywhere. So the overview is for the first 10 minutes to kind of talk about this concept of digital architectures and give you kind of a brief introduction to it, to set the stage for two studies that are focused on disinformation. The first one being a simulated cyber attack that I ran on Twitter during the 2018 US election. And then the second is looking at how people engaged with tweets from the Russian IRA during the 2016 US election. So each chunk will be about 10 minutes. And so the basic argument is quite simple, and that's that whenever a politician communicates on social media, or journalists are reporting, or citizens are talking, that communication is going to be mediated by the way that a platform is coded and designed. So if we look at these examples from Guy Verhofstadt, we'll see that this is the same Facebook posts, but you'll see here there's a hashtag on Twitter. On Facebook, there's not. There's also this @mention on Twitter, and on Facebook, it's not activated because of the protocols of the platform. And we also know that because Instagram is built in a different way, it's more visual, less room for text, we actually don't see that story pop up on Guy Verhofstadt's Instagram page. So the argument being that the way that platforms are coded and designed influences how political actors communicate. So the kind of operating definition is that the digital architecture of a social media platform is the sort of set of technical protocols that facilitate, constrain, and shape user behavior in a virtual space. So in short, it's what the platform allows us to do, what it allows us not to do, and how it shapes the way that we communicate, whether that's through different reactions or upvotes and downvotes, or being able to share and not being able to share. These have implications for political communication, and sometimes I think that's overlooked, especially in academia, but also in the policy space as well. So in my research, what I've kind of been looking at is this kind of classic design theory. So this is kind of a roadmap for how to build a trailer that you would connect to a car. And essentially, the idea is looking at what does this thing actually need to do, and then what are the components that make it do that. So here's the example of a trailer, which is on the left. You have, what does it need to do? Okay, it needs to, for example, connect to a vehicle. Well, you need to design a hitch for that, and that hitch goes there. So the idea is to kind of look at what are the functions of the platform, what are the features that allow those functions, and how do they work together? And so here's a very simple example. As technologies get more complex, the mapping gets more complex, and I think social media are very complex technologies. And so trying to do this is what I've been doing in my research. And you can check out this article that's open access, where I basically identified 4 categories of the architectures that I think are particularly relevant for political communication in this context, particularly for political campaigning. And I'm going to briefly introduce you to those and kind of the general approach. And if you'd like, you can go and read more about it in the paper. So the first is network structure, and this is how connections between accounts are created and maintained. So what I do in the paper is I basically make these different maps that show, okay, if people are trying to find a political candidate online, then searchability becomes a factor. And how searchable are candidates compared across these 4 platforms? On Facebook, it's very easy to find a candidate. You just type in their name. On Twitter, it's easy but can be difficult because of all the parody accounts and bots. Whereas on Snapchat, at least in 2016, you had to know the exact username of that politician, and they didn't really follow any standard format. Then you have connectivity. This is whether you can just follow someone without being their friend, or does that friend have to accept your friend request, which seems like a small change between Facebook and, let's say, Twitter or Instagram, but actually research shows that because of this simple design choice, the networks that the same person has across Facebook and Twitter don't actually overlap, which I think is quite interesting. And then we also have the privacy settings, right? What are you allowed to do in terms of being searched affects clearly who can connect with you and how they can. So this is just one example of the networks, how different design features across platforms might have implications for political communication. The second, and this is definitely the broadest category, is the functionality. So how can users actually engage with the technology? If we look at hardware, what type of devices can you access the platform from? And I'll come back to that. But also things like the broadcast feed, how it actually looks in a mobile versus a desktop. But I want to focus particularly on supported media. And this is clearly, we talk a lot about Twitter having 140 or 280 characters. Clearly, you can't have as much information being conveyed there as on Facebook, where you can have 63,000. There you can, upload transcripts of speeches and debates. But particularly, this is important for video, right? On Facebook, you can live stream, and you can have up to 45-minute video. I think it's now an hour. Whereas on Twitter and Instagram, you're limited to 1 or 2 minutes. And so clearly those platforms are more suited for sound bites and advertisements. And so these different lengths and the constraints on what type of media is allowed. For example, on Instagram, you can't hyperlink, which really affects how campaigns can raise money because they can't put links into their posts. So these type of architectural features are kind of what I'm getting at in the paper, and I'll provide some examples of this as we move along. The third is algorithmic filtering. So we have all this content flowing across platforms. How is it filtered through algorithms? So we know that the reach of a post on Facebook is really determined by the algorithms, whereas on Twitter, you can and Instagram as well, you can actually get outside of your follower network by using hashtags, right? Well, political campaigns, organizations, businesses, they can override these algorithms by paying to promote content in ways that the typical user cannot. And finally, datafication, which is how our interactions are datafied into points that can be modeled. And here, I focus on matching, which is taking offline data and using that to match people to their online profiles, targeting, advertising, and then how those targeted advertisements generate analytics that can inform future messages. So I know that's a lot, but again, it's just an introduction. But I want to focus particularly, going back to functionality, on Snapchat. What is the implication that Snapchat is only available on a smartphone? It's not available through a desktop or a mobile browser. Well, I talked to a couple digital directors for different campaigns. This is Marco Rubio's digital director, who was saying the unique thing about Snapchat is you can't upload a video, you can't take that content back to headquarters and filter it because it's on a smartphone and because it's limited to a smartphone. And so what does that mean? If we look at an example of the same event from on the left, you have Snapchat, on the right, you have Instagram, you'll see that on Snapchat, supporters are kind of waiting for the candidate. The phone cannot really take in these objects that are farther away, they're pixelated. Whereas on Instagram, you have supporters sort of doing what supporters are supposed to do, wave their signs, the candidate's front and center, you have a nice light and the picture is sharper because the campaign can take content, filter it, release it at a strategic time point, and also have a greater image control over how the candidate is presented. So that's just one example of how the hardware difference between Snapchat and Instagram lends certain strategic advantages to campaigns for using Instagram, but also in terms of information, you'll see that on the left that the supporters were counted at 2,500 at the event, and then afterwards, when the campaign uploaded their total tally, it increased by 1,500 people. So this has information about when you have a more immediate platform like Snapchat, do you have time to actually accurately promote information, whereas on Instagram, you have the time to fact check it. So that's leading in a bit to the disinformation part of the talk. So moving into the second point, this is a study that you can find open access at this link that looked at how susceptible are Americans to being spearphished or clicking on disinformation during an election. And the idea for this study came about by looking at a number of media reports that were talking about how US government employees were being targeted on Twitter by particularly Russian, but also Iranian and Chinese hackers who were hiding links that would either bring someone to a page asking them for their login credentials, such as happened with the John Podesta emails and the DNC in 2016, or it would bring them to a website that would then download malicious software onto their device and then take control of that person's phone or computer and then crawl into a government network and sort of steal information. This classic digital cyber espionage. And so This brings into question some of these ideas about Russian automation and Russian bots, but not in the context of just spreading information or disinformation, but rather actually being much more of a traditional form of weaponry. Because if we think about a missile, the actual warhead is just that little part at the top, right? The rest of the missile is computers and fuel in order to get that weapon to its target. And the question is, are digital platforms, social media platforms, now that type of apparatus or an attack vector that can deliver a malicious payload, in this case, a virus, to a government employee's computer? So this gets into the social engineering part of the talk. Social engineering is basically a form of trickery where you try to trick someone into doing an action, particularly giving over sensitive information that would benefit an attacker. So classic example of this is phishing via email, the Nigerian print scam where you're asked to provide your bank information so that someone can send you a large sum of money. And now we basically have phishing that can be automated through social media platforms. And that creates, first of all, a more one-to-one type of targeting, but also phishing at scale. And I think that's the interesting part. That's kind of what we're seeing going on between governments attacking employees. So, this is nothing new to this audience, but Facebook released some of the key problems they're seeing with their platforms, and phishing is one of them, and this targeted phishing or spear phishing is one they mentioned. Also disinformation, and also the spreading of fake news, disinformation via bots. And so I wanted to see, can I design an experiment that actually tests, okay, how likely are people to actually click on these type of attacks that I just presented to you? So I focused on Twitter and kind of linking this to the digital architectures. Twitter's architecture is a Fisher's paradise. You can create new accounts very easily. You can automate accounts very easily. It's a very public platform that is conducive to open source intelligence gathering. So if you were checking in different places, or you're taking pictures, and you are working for a government, your actions can essentially be tracked very, very publicly, and also those of your family members, which is important. It supports short URLs like bit.ly or Google Firebase links that hide essentially the ultimate destination of a link. So if you see a bit.ly link on Twitter, you don't know where it's actually going to lead unless you run it through a link checker, which most people don't. You can @mention people that are not in your network, and Twitter has this news-oriented content profile, meaning there's a lot of news on the platform, so it's easy to sort of hide disinformation or fake news in the platform. So that's the reason that I chose to run this experiment on Twitter. And what it was essentially a simulated cyber attack. And I took a Python program developed by some cybersecurity researchers called Snapper. And what it does is you feed in a list of users, so a list of usernames. The program scrapes their recent tweets and then uses a very basic form of machine learning to generate a new message to that user based on what they've already said, based on what they've already tweeted. So if you're someone who's tweeting a lot about sports, then the program will generate a message to you probably about sports in the language that you use. And so what it does is it @mentions the user, inserts a generated tweet, and then I added a little down hand emoji to get people to click on a short URL, which looked like this. It was just a breaking news link that came from a account I made to impersonate a news outlet called the DC News Report. So this is the stimuli that people would get. They would be @mentioned, they would get a generated tweet that's been automatically generated based on their interests, and a hand pointing to say, click on this link. So here is the Twitter account of the Washington Post, which was kind of the base to make the DC News Report. And here you can see the how the link looked on Twitter. So in terms of who I wanted to target for this sort of cyber attack, I wanted to focus on people who were politically expressive, but also partisan Twitter users, so either left-wing or right-wing, and very expressive. I searched for the term midterm. a couple months before the election. This was during the time of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in the United States, which is a very polarized event and a very good opportunity to capture whether people were expressing left-wing or right-wing views. I kept only those users in the data set that had between 50 and 400 followers to kind of get a sense of the kind of average Twitter user and filter out large organizations and then likely bots who had less than 50 followers, and then scraped their Twitter timelines, separated them based on whether they were right-wing or left-wing users on these hashtags, took a random sample of 10 of each of these users' tweets and kept them in the data set if at least 8 of them were political, meaning roughly that 80% of their tweets were about politics, and at least 8 came from the same device, mobile or desktop, which is important because most of the literature suggests that you're more likely to click disinformation or click one of these spear phishing links on a mobile device because it's a smaller screen and you have less cues to see whether something is fake or not versus a larger desktop screen. So overall, 138 users were included in the study because Twitter eventually shut down the bot. So there were more planned. But here's an example of what it looked like for a left-wing user. You'll see their @ mentioned. The machine generates this tweet that kind of more or less makes sense. It's not the best performing algorithm in the world. I thought about trying to make it better, but I really wanted to keep this attack sort of basic because if they would have clicked the DC News report, they would have seen that it had 0 followers. So it was clearly fake, but interestingly, only 2 or 3 people actually went and verified the source of this account, which is also interesting. And some people even retweeted the content without even checking the source validity. Here's a right-wing example. Again, you can see how the machine just kind of splices different parts of tweets together. And the question is, well, how many people still clicked this link? And I want to emphasize that it was not a real cyber attack. The link actually led to a Google form, a survey that asked people about their social media use, and 8 people were kind enough to fill that out. So the overall results is that of these 138 people that were targeted, 1 in 5 clicked the link, which is, I think, is a pretty high number. And I ran some tests to see whether, right or left wing people would click more, or whether mobile users or desktop users would click more. And it turns out that those were not significant predictors. So basically, it didn't matter what side of the political spectrum you were on or what device you were on. You had about a 1 in 5 chance of clicking this link. And so the argument there is that spear phishing, the chance that one will click on it cross-cuts ideology and devices, which is kind of an interesting figure, that people are not really checking the source and they're kind of indiscriminate about what they click online. So that's the end of that. And now I'll move into the final part of the presentation, which looks at how or who was engaging with tweets from the IRA on Twitter. And it's a bit complicated because we started this project right after all these revelations came out, and since then there's been better and better data sets. But I think this is something we find something interesting that I think really people who are working in this space should consider more about, which is looking at Sockpuppets, which I'll talk about in just a second. So in terms of how much disinformation is out there, there's been a lot of studies published recently that show that it's essentially less than maybe the media leads us to believe. We see that at least in the American context. So we see on Twitter, 1% of the political news that the average American sees is disinformation. But it's important to keep in mind that not everyone looks at political news. Political news is a subset of entertainment and all the other types of interactions on social media. So it actually turns out to be a fraction of a percent of what the average American sees on Twitter. On Facebook, during the US election in 2016, 8.5% of Americans shared a fake news story, but only one story. And if we think about that in the context of how many stories and how much content is being shared on social media, that 8.5% figure becomes a little bit more diluted. And there's been some estimates that 6% of the IRA links shared on Twitter were fake news, because actually what we find is that the IRA was sharing real news from fake accounts. So what I'm interested in here is Sockpuppets, and this is different from studying fake news accounts like the one I showed you in the last study. This is looking at impersonated accounts of citizens. So people who, or trolls who hide themselves behind identities that mimic, let's say certain European nationalities or certain ethnicities. This is something that hasn't been looked at so much in the disinformation literature. But we've seen, if you're familiar with the show Catfish, people do this for romantic purposes all the time. They make a fake profile with fake pictures in order to catfish someone. And interestingly, the fish in Catfish refers to fishing, like spearfishing we talked about in the last study. So interesting there. So I've written a bit about this in the context of spies, and spies who particularly use LinkedIn as a way to recruit lower level government employees to join their own spy network. So here are some examples of Chinese spies who have been using LinkedIn to recruit German service officers to essentially do work on the part of the Chinese. And LinkedIn is a very, very good platform for this type of phishing, particularly because governments, they have entire lists of all the employees that work for them in a LinkedIn group, which becomes very easy for governments to basically harvest that data and then target all of those people through a spear phishing attack. So that's just a quick plug if you want to learn more about how that works. Okay, so going back to Sockpuppets, I think, and this is the kind of important thing I want to stress here, is that most of the existing studies, reports, approaches to disinformation, they focus on disinformation from fake news sources, not from accounts that are created to look like citizens. And I think this is what helps explain why we see these low disinformation figures on Facebook and Twitter, because the academic literature would have us suggest that sock puppetry is probably more persuasive than information coming from fake news outlets, because we know trust in news on social media is low. We don't really know if there's an effect of this type of fake news disinformation on public opinion, but we know that information that are shared by peers on social media is persuasive. So information shared by your friends or from people who come from your same ethnicity or socioeconomic status, that is a type of information that people tend to trust on social media. So what we do in the paper is we develop this model of network disinformation where, just to kind of walk you through it, we have a troll. In this case, it's a Norwegian troll, and that troll creates an account as a sock puppet, a fake identity that someone then retweets to their friends and followers. And I think this is where you see the effective disinformation, because these people are getting information from someone they know and trust who has been tricked or socially engineered by a troll. So we were interested to kind of see how this mechanism was working in the case of the IRA on Twitter. We were looking at basically what were the main identities that these accounts were adopting, what topics did they actually tweet about, and which ones were the most successful in terms of getting engagement. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. So what we did is, on the right, early on in this study, when the first data sets were coming out, we basically just looked and saw, okay, who are these accounts impersonating? When they're tweeting, what are they tweeting about? They're tweeting pro-Trump stuff, anti-Trump stuff, fake news categories. And interestingly, on the left, there were two other researchers that did the same thing, and we came up with similar but kind of different categories. And the key difference is that we decided that this Black activist category, people who are impersonating African-American identities, were their own category, whereas these other group of researchers treated them as left wing, which makes sense, but that distinction will be important, as I'll show you in a second. Because if we look at the tweets that the IRA accounts actually sent, we'll see that the most were non-English, followed by these sort of fake news accounts, and then people impersonating right-wing Americans. So this is where the most tweets were coming from. The Black troll category was not so numerous in terms of IRA activity, but if we look at tweets that got at least one reaction, we see that Black troll tweets coming from Black trolls, 70% of them got likes and over 70% of them got retweets. And then we see right-wing trolls, left-wing trolls, and then down in the middle is where the news feed is. So it seems that Black, right, and left-wing identities are more likely to get engagement than newsfeed accounts. So we decided to test this at a more statistical level by looking at which sock puppet categories, or which fake impersonated accounts got the most engagement in terms of retweets, likes, and replies. We did a bunch of statistics I won't go into here, but these are the results, and I'll explain to you how these tables work. Essentially, the more asterisks, if you see an asterisk, it means that, for this case, retweets, that the identities on the left were correlated with getting retweets. So what we find is that the strongest predictor for getting retweets on Twitter from the IRA was the black troll category. So black trolls were the strongest predictor for getting retweets. Now we have two models here. On the one, we have where we separated black trolls as a distinct category, and then we also ran tests using the previous categories from the other researchers that said that black trolls would be counted as left trolls. And what that shows, just to explain it, is that these researchers argued that left-wing accounts were getting the most engagement, but when we separate the black troll category, we find that it's the black trolls that are driving that conclusion. So it's an interesting dynamic that the black trolls weren't that numerous in number, but they were so strongly correlated with getting retweets that in other research, that explains why their main findings is that the left-wing trolls got the most engagement. So to reset, if I lost you on the regression tables, black, left, and right-wing trolls were all correlated with getting engagement. They were all predictors to be retweeted. The newsfeed category was not. So fake news accounts were not correlated with getting engagement, meaning there was no effect of being a fake news account on the likelihood to be retweeted, whereas all three identities were. It's the exact same thing for likes. In this case, black, left, and right-wing trolls were very, very strongly correlated with getting likes. So if one of these accounts sent a tweet, it was very likely to be liked, but not for the news feed. So fake news accounts did not get very much engagement at all, whereas all of these sock puppet categories did. And I think that tells us, this is one data set from one country, from one election, but I think it does point to a broader phenomenon that we should be looking at identities, not fake news accounts. So we thought maybe that the IRA was just retweeting their own tweets, like a botnet or something, but it turns out that wasn't the case. Less than 3% of the IRA's retweets came from other IRA accounts, so it doesn't really affect our findings much. And so the conclusion is that the IRA mostly impersonated fake news outlets and right-wing American citizens. This is where they sent the most tweets from these accounts. But Twitter users reacted most to the sock puppet identities, or the sock puppets that were posing as identities. So even though the IRA was sending most of their tweets from fake news outlets, the ones that were getting engagements were the black, right, and left-wing trolls. Twitter users reacted least to fake news. And I think the kind of take-home point here is that when you're trying to measure disinformation by looking at information from fake news outlets, you're probably A, underestimating the amount of disinformation online, and B, you're probably not looking at where the effective disinformation is. And so that is the take-home point, is that the sock puppets seem to matter way more than fabricated news outlets. So I think I've kept the time, and I'll end with a quick plug to the podcast. Thank you for plugging it earlier, and I'm looking forward to answer your questions.